this is a witch deck profile, which I actually built this list a while back, back in later in last year, but then I didn't have time to really put together deck profile. So much stuff going on, and lack of motivation at the time. So, as I say, better late than never, and I actually do mean it literally because the deck hasn't really changed at all since then. There's barely any premium support like ever, especially for these sort of decks. So currently the state of the deck would be about the same as it was back then. And I've got the new card that they did add in, which is Administrate Angel, which was already kind of a card I was playing, but I think I got the card awkwardly, a bit of an awkward time because it came out like during the season, so I didn't always have access to it. The thing is, I was actually looking to play this for BCS, but then I pulled out last minute because I got very paranoid, and then I played Magus instead, which was a bit messy to use, but it's because of the Chaos Breaker matchup, more or less. That matchup is a pain to deal with, but essentially the deck is very net zero, so there's a lot of 1-for-1s or 3-for-3s going on in this deck, but there isn't actually as much plussing as other OTT decks may necessarily do. So that's sort of how Chaos in the long game just eventually outgrinds you if you're still playing the game by then. And Momo, which is one of the best things to use against Chaos, is a lot weaker in this deck actually compared to other OTT decks, where they can sort of sustain their hand sizes better than in this deck, where this deck actually kind of sabotages you because it's getting rid of your front rows and all that stuff. It's limiting out all the kind of aggression you can do in the first place, and then so if you need to go long game to use Momos and things, because let's just say they're still on 2 damage, right? They're going to take one of your attacks anyway, and then the other Momo, they just PG it, which is still whole turn of setbacks, and then they'll probably have built a lot of hand to then survive another Momo and so on. So there's a lot of weird stuff with this deck, actually, which makes it very awkward against Chaos. And if they use Barret and Dragon, they can just wipe out all the protection in your hand as well, which is another problem this deck has, where it just gets sabotaged badly against Chaos. It's funny because it's Chaos is not really that complained about compared to Gridora or Meg Colony, but the deck does much better against Gridora than it does against Chaos. So right now, to go through the deck list, the whole concept why I revived this deck in the first place, why I was looking to use it, was because of History Collection. So I think this is actually the best deck probably at the time that I could mix Susanoo into, which was the Witch deck. Because Witches, they're kind of semi-generic, but obviously you want to play as many Witches as you can. But then they also have their own aggressive engine as well, whereas Magus, they have their own restanding rearguard, but you need a full Magus board, which is a problem at times. And I mean, they both have their own pros and cons, which I can get to into later, but the thing with Susanoo as well is that when you're searching for Susanoo, you're not actually negging harder because Magus needs a full Magus board. So when you call Amuna Murakumo, for example, to search for Susanoo, you're then going to call over the Amuna Murakumo with another Magus, provided you have enough Magus cards, because you still need to draw 6 Magus cards. And then you call a Magus into Amuna Murakumo, which means your searcher was actually a neg 2, a neg 1, if anything, or a neg 2 if you count boosts as a neg, because then you're calling a new boost on top, but you're losing more hand. So it really does kind of hurt in a sense when you do that. So that's kind of a problem with Magus, whereas Witches, you don't care if you have non-Witches on the field. So that helps a lot. Obviously, this isn't the V-Series Amuna Murakumo like I would have had in my older deck profiles, because you're not really blindly searching for any old Witch Grade 3 anymore. Now you're just you're searching for specifically Susanoo, so that you can ride up and stride, of course. But if you played 4 copies of Susanoo, then you'd have more reason to play the V-Series Amuna Murakumo. However, it's also a stride assist, and being a stride assist does have its merits as well, because this deck really doesn't want to discard its Grade 3s to stride if it can help it. So there is that benefit too. Now, there's 2 copies of Susanoo in this deck list. The reason I played 2, I was trying 2 as well, but you can play 1. Obviously, if you damage check 1, it really does hurt, because it means you can't search anymore. But even if that's not what you're worried about, another reason you may want to play 2 is because if you have 1 in your hand already, but you don't want to discard your Grade 3s to stride, or drop 2 to stride even, then you can use the other Amuna Murakumo in your hand to reveal your Susanoo, and then you search your deck for a second copy of Susanoo, and then you drop Susanoo to stride onto Susanoo into Kirin. So that's actually a reason you can play 2. Obviously, one of the reasons you may play 1, damage checking risk aside, is that you may also just want to have more grade 1s and 2s. That's also a reason, which this deck is not too bad actually with riding grade 1s and 2s. But essentially with these other grade 3s, so we've got Yo-Yo and we've got Zozo. They're very important. Yo-Yo is what gives you the restand or re-ride attack plays, and then Zozo actually adds more power to it. Now, Yo-Yo is something, well, Yo-Yo and Zozo is weird because you have to actually try and ride a Witch Vanguard. Now that you're not playing Coco in this list, that means Coco is no longer the optimal ride, which means that Zozo and Yo are basically competing to be the Witch Vanguard, or rather competing not to be the Witch Vanguard. And so you're keeping whatever's your hand based on which one you think you might need. So you always have to keep an eye on your ratios, like how many copies of Yo-Yo and Zozo you've been through, to try and work out probabilities of you being able to hit into one of them. So when you start your turn and you ride over Susanoo, let's just say, or you ride going second into grade 3 for your turn 3, then what you need to determine is whether you might be able to find Yo-Yo again or whether you might be able to find Zozo again. And that's the risk you're playing with when you're running this deck. It's basically that. You have to take a bit of a gamble. If you decide to go Dragon King, for example, then you got to think about calling Yo-Yo from your deck, which, by the way, fails a lot. So I actually don't like going second in this deck anymore now. Now I actually prefer going first because Dragon King just feels horrible. Things just go really badly with it. Unless you have the hand. If you happen to have the hand, then it's all cool. But when you don't, it's really bad. So you try to get on your front row. Just be wary of hand traps and things, because if you're doing things on first stride, as in Dragon King stride turn, your opponent can kill Yo-Yo with things. But once you get to Ichikishima, then there's very few cards that can kill Yo-Yo in the entire game. So you'll be safe by that point, but against most matchups besides like Fenrir or something, right? Or even Spike Brothers, but I don't think anyone's playing the promo that negates effects, because that would obviously stop Yo-Yo. But if you were also worried about hand traps, you could technically call 2 Yo-Yos, and then one of them will just trigger anyway. So there is always that line of play. Now, Zozo is important because it gives you more power up. So Oracle Think Tank, especially when you're not playing Guard Restricts, does have the weakness of powering up. So when you're playing, sorry, not Oracle Think Tank, but Witches rather. So Witches, most of the cards actually don't power up in general. Only one that does is Poo Poo. But when you've got now more cards that your opponent can use to guard because of grade 3 heal triggers, then you've got to also consider that. So having power up as much as you can is always helpful. It's better than riding vanilla. Besides, your Vanguard, if all it's doing is attacking for 12k, it's so easy for your opponent to be like, oh, I'm on 13k, maybe I'll want to pass, and then you fail to get triggers, or they'll do like a 10k drop, 1 grade 1 used to guard, and it'll be 2 to pass. So it becomes too easy to guard, or if they get damage triggers as well. So obviously that's one reason you want to go to Zozo, to give your units 5k for every protection in your hand. And of course your rear guards benefit massively. There's a lot of multiplier value to it as well. So it's just so good all around. And if you hit CB1 draw, it's an option you've got as well, just in case, give you a bit more leverage. But CB management is actually one of the weaknesses in this deck as well, because obviously Yo-Yo requires Counterblast, and if you use something like Ichikishima, that's also a Counterblast. But thing is, if you don't have Counterblast to begin with, then it's likelier that, especially early on in the game, that your opponent just didn't hit you as much. So there is always that, unless your opponent plays like one of those decks where they've got Force 2 or crit stacking or whatever, and then it just damage choking you, then that becomes a bit of a problem. But if it's more like gradual damage, like Shlishma, for example, or Aquaforce, your typical everyday Aquaforce play, most decks, what most decks do these days, which is just multi-attack for 1 damage, then it's okay. And obviously if that happens, then the chances are that your hand is still fine, so you never need to use Ichikishima anyway to CB1 and draw 2. So you're kind of fine there if that happens. You just need 1 CB for Yo-Yo at the minimum. But Ichikishima, the other thing as well is that traditionally you've always needed Counterblast for Ichikishima to get your GB3, because you need to flip each unit. However, with History Collection, you've now got the option where you can basically get your GB2 even when you ride first. So you ride first, you get your GB2 active right away. And then that means next turn, even if your opponent damaged and died you, or you only had 1 CB to use for Yo-Yo, you don't have to use Ichikishima's skill to activate GB3, because you've now got the GB3 as soon as you start Ichikishima. So that's just in case you don't G-Guard as well. Which, by the way, another reason. So a reason why this deck does better against Gridora now is because if you ride first, you're going into a History Collection stride, which means now you've got your Generation Break, which means you can do Ichikishima, while your opponent already has Gridora active. So before, what would happen is that Gridora most likely would have the Bagri to game the Witches, And then you'd ride grade 3 first, then it's their go. They do Gridora, you can't G-guard. Now your go, you stride into some very basic strides at that point in the game. So you can't do Chikishima that soon, but now you can because you've got Susanoo, who gets your generation break while your opponent's on grade 2. So because of that, this deck now has a much better matchup against Gridora. So it's very helpful because Ichikishima is the main stride of the deck, but most decks they have strong first strides, but Witches not so much. They're not the best. I mean, Momo is a strong first stride, but you have to discard 3, and it messes up your hand. So really, Momo's only really that good if you're trying to go for the game a lot of times. So as in like in general in OTT, there are cases where Momo isn't used as a finisher, but generally you want to be used as a finisher as a general principle. Now, you may notice here I've got 2 copies of Popo. Popo is there more like when you go to like turn 6. So this deck doesn't actually deck out quite as fast as some of my other OTT decks do, because there isn't really as much compression going on in this deck. There's a lot of, I mean, you got the twin drives because of the rewriting play, but other than that, there's really not much compression going on compared to like normal Susanoo or something. So because of that, it's a turn 6 play rather than the turn 5 play rather than the turn 4 play, which most OT decks usually try to do it for turn 4. So that's kind of a key difference. But the thing is, once you get to the late game, being able to kind of access 5 drive checks and then hopefully hit crits, and then you just go Popo for game, just close out the game, bypass those protect gifts, and hopefully you've made your opponent use Elementary Sanctitude during that entire game as well, because you're beating them down. It does seem like the deck that actually does the best against Sanctitude, which is actually, by the way, a reason why I do think Susanoo Witch is arguably is one of the best OTT decks at the moment, because it's the least susceptible to the Blitz Order mechanic, whereas any sort of traditional triple attack OTT deck just suffers now against Sanctitude and Blitz Orders. They do suffer a bit against grade 3 heals, but that's the whole point of Zozo. It helps to get past that, so it does feel like it cares the least about all the defensive stuff going on in the game, except when your units start getting locked, then that's a problem. But yeah, that's kind of more or less it. It's searchable with Mumu as well, so the witch name helps. Then you've got 4 copies of Pupu, so Pupu is the main ride of the deck. Now, other than Pupu, the only other grade 2 I'm playing is Administrate Angel in this list. I've been playing a list that had Tete before. You could potentially put Tete in as well because it's a searchable grade 2 with Mumu. So the reason for like low grade 2 count is that Mumu is actually a pseudo grade 2 searcher as well, because when you have all these grade 1s, let's just say you ride a different grade 1 and you have Mumu, then what you can do is you can look at top 5 and then hopefully find a grade 2 and grade 2 witch, and then you ride a grade 2 witch. So there is an advantage of playing more grade 2 witches, is that Tete, for example, you can just have more targets to then ride into grade 2. But in this version, I've got Administrate Angel instead, which is an option as well you can go for. So Administrate Angel is actually, funny enough, a grade 1 search enough himself, because he can look for grade 2 or less, and that can just end up, either just a grade 2 or less to core or ride. So they're both playing cards that kind of help to search for the alternate grade to deal with the awkward riding things that happen. Now, Pupu's ability is very similar to Zozo. She gains 5k for every Sentinel actually in your hand, so that's not just protect gifts, but any Sentinel you can reveal. And it's a rear guard skill only, so you can't do it if you ride. So if you ride as a grade 2, the only thing you can do is the Vanguard specific effect, which is on ride, discard a card and then get protect gift. But you're not actually doing a very good grade 2 game. She's actually the best witch specific named card for grade 2 gaming, but it's just not enough on her own. Like, every deck can do a lot more than what she does on her own. She has to carry everything, and she's not plussing anyway. So witches have never had a good grade 2 game. It's always been more for ride up, be rewarded for constantly riding up kind of deck. And Mumu, the grade 1, she's a +1, but she's a bit of a lagged +1 because she's a Soul Blast 1 to rest, so you're already losing a booster, which means your field has weaker units, and if you're against like a 10k base deck, then a lot of times you do struggle to hit with that. Well, generally with witches. So that's always been an issue, but you're not making use of your pluses until the long term. So it's a very it's a slow return on investment to kind of feel the impact of the pluses, which doesn't help in the grade 2 game all that well. So that's just another thing. Another issue that this deck does have as well is that even though I've got Administrate Angel, in this as the second grade 2. You do need to find different boosters if you use Mumu, because Mumu is a rest ability, so when you rest, then you're losing a booster as well. So you've got to be careful how you arrange your board. Mumu is usually better to have behind the Vanguard normally. Obviously, case by case basis, you may change that, but usually as a general thing, it's generically better to have behind the Vanguard, and then you just make room for a different booster behind Admin Angel. Ideally, Amna Murakumo will become the booster. Now, the other thing about Administrate Angel is that he's also good for checking for triggers, whether you're doing it for drive checks or damage checks. The only downside is when you do it for drive checks, the thing is that Yo-Yo only works on the first battle, so you can't stack for your, let's say, your stride attack, or even if you just sat on Yo-Yo, which doesn't happen as often, but let's just say you do. You can't do Admin Angel first and then Yo-Yo because you'll miss the timing. You have to do it on first battle because they're trying to limit how many attacks you do in the deck. But then when you go to Zozo, Zozo gives your front row power. So then if you decide to attack with Admin Angel before Zozo, you're basically able to try and stack the deck for triggers. However, you have to also balance that out with the fact that you're going to miss out on Admin Angel profiting from the power gains. So that's actually a judgment call you have to make. It's also counterblast cost, so you also have to look into how much counterblast you have available. And again, as I said earlier, the deck does have counterblast issues. So that's just something to kind of note as well. You could maybe change some of the cards that I've got in this list around countercharge PGs maybe to help add more countercharging. Like maybe if you want to take, say for example, Honolulu out or something, you could do that. To be honest, I'm not sure how big Honolulu is right now. I'm not playing Premium quite as much as before. Back then when History Collection came out, there was a lot of aggro decks kind of at the start, but then people started kind of normalizing lower volumes of attacks, let's just say. So Honolly's more of a meta-call card, but if you want to take that risk, you could do that. Well, for the reward of having countercharge PGs. So Admin Angel, even if you don't use it for stacking triggers for Zozo, you can also use it for damage checks as well to set up heal triggers, or even just any old damage trigger, so you can build a damage wall next turn. And then hopefully you can serve more guard values so that you can then maintain even protect gifts in the process to then hit again next turn as well. Now, another grade 2 that I did quite like is Diorung. Diorung can also be used, Knights of Excision Diorung. It's a Keta Sanctuary grade 2, the one that Loire decks are using to add PGs to hand in the D format. It's a generic Keta card that a lot of people want to pick up. But you just search for any card that's the same clan as your Vanguard from your drop zone, add it to your hand. There's a Soul Blast 1 cost, so you can even use the Soul Blaster card for that. And that helps with just retrieving key cards. Like, for example, if you've lost your Yo-Yos or Zozos under some tragic circumstances, then you can use Diorung to retrieve them so that they're not just completely out of the game. Next, Honolulu. So Honolulu is mainly just for countering aggro decks. You can also remove him from play if you need to have him out of the board, out of the field even. There aren't really that many boosters, so you're not really competing. But if you play this card in something like Magus, well, Magus actually works a lot better now with Honolulu because Magus needs 6 Magus units, so you can apply Honolulu's effect without having Honolulu taking up your field space, which is really good. And then next we've got Mumu. So Mumu, I already mentioned earlier, it can search for witch cards. So you're resting it, Soul Blast 1, look at top 5, look for a witch. But if you reveal 3 rather than 2 or less, if you reveal 3 witches, she stays on the field. But if you don't reveal 3, then you move her into Soul. You can do it on purpose, so you can choose, like, you see 3 witches, for example, but you want to soul charge Mumu, then you can just show them 1 witch, and then just add that 1 witch to your hand, and then just put Mumu into your soul. You can do that. And the other effect that Mumu has, besides being a very good witch searcher that just helps you find stuff that you need as and when, the grade 1 on Vanguard skill is when you ride on top of her with a witch Vanguard, which, by the way, that's a downside of Admin Angel being in this deck. When you ride her on top of her with a witch card, you get to draw 1 for free. So not like Circle Magus, which is CB1 to draw, or like a lot of other decks, they have their own version that can just write any card to draw for free, but like Gear Chronicle. But for some reason, Oracle Think Tank, they have CB1 costs tied to theirs, and they also have sub-clan restricted versions of them, which is just, yeah, kind of funny actually to kind of point out. But Amna Murakumo also there, as mentioned earlier. I've already gone through that stuff with History Collection. Let's just go to the next bit. So starting Vanguard, doesn't matter what you play. One counter charge heal trigger just in case, but really the grade 3 heals are helpful because you need grade 3 heals to search for Susanoo if you don't have the witches in your hand, of course. But also the thing with grade 3 heals is that this deck is, as I mentioned earlier, it has a very bad early game. You're drawing into a lot of grade 3s a lot of the times, so having a grade 3 heal to be able to then power up your Vanguard and then try and hopefully just ward off some of the attacks can help as well, because otherwise you might just find yourself dropping so many cards to guard, especially if your opponent's going first. So that's the whole point of playing the grade 3 heals as much as possible. If you draw that one counter charge heal during the game, then that can help to maybe make a difference when you're trying to counter charge. So you can use, let's just say your opponent's damage choking you, then at least you've got that one off summon in the deck, which can come up a fair enough amount of times. But if that happens to be your one card early game where you're being aggroed, then that's obviously a risk you're taking. Then there's the red over trigger, just to get more attacks, because multi-tagging in this deck is really good as well. And when you're doing 5 drives, you're more likely to hit a critical trigger. So when you're resending a card that has a crit, it makes things so much stronger. And it's very game breaking. Then in addition to that, we have 3 Sentinel crits, but one of the G era versions, so the one that when you damage check you draw. But obviously if you have Susanoo as your Vanguard, you can move into your Soul 5 to Vanguard and draw. So this is because the ratio at the moment, for this list anyway, it's more heavier on playing as many kind of one card to guard, because your protect gifts are supposed to be your PGs, but obviously you don't want to have too many 2 card drop guards, because then your hand just shrinks really easily. So that's kind of the idea behind it. But I am a bit mixed, because I mentioned Barrier End Dragon earlier. Barrier End Dragon has the problem where in Chaos Breaker, when you use Barrier End, they can wipe out all your protect gifts. But not only do they wipe out all your protect gifts and all that stuff, and of course over trigger is always going to be a problem if they have the over trigger, but Barrier End also gains 10,000 for every single protect gift wiped out, and it also gains a critical for every protect gift wiped out, which means if your hand doesn't have enough raw shield value, then that's it, game over, you lose the game. In fact, that's actually how I lost our locals. I went into a tournament once with this deck. I think I won all my games except for one game where my opponent is playing like a Messiah deck, and he just casually walked into Barrier End Dragon and then just destroyed my hand, and I took like 5 damage or something like that. A lot of damage, and I just got overkilled by that. So that's actually an argument why you might want to maybe consider playing an additional Perfect Guard just in case of the Chaos matchup, or not Chaos, but like any Link Joker deck, because Barrier End is a generic strat. You can use it in any deck, and it makes any Link Joker deck in general scary because of the lack of Perfect Guards aren't protect gifts. So just something to bear in mind. 3 Celestia Witch Toto, so that's the Stride crit. The fine thing about this card is that this is playable in Witches for its name, because it's a Witch card, and you know there's hardly any subclan premium collection cards in general. They don't exist mostly, but she's one of the rare ones that belongs to a subclan. So when you're using Mumu and you don't want to lose Mumu, then you can just reveal the crit, and then you end up having your 3 cards revealed, and you get to save it for another turn, which is always handy. Weirdly enough, I usually play 4 in my other OT decks, but for some reason I only end up playing 3 in the actual Witch subclan itself, which just a fun fact about it really. But Psychic Bird, 4 copies. It's soul charges, which is always good, and you're drawing deep into your deck as well, so you can find stuff. Always good to have those in any deck. And then going into the orders, we've got 1 copy of Forbidor, which I think this card, not very good against Maid Colony, but it is good for searching Yo-Yo, so that's always helpful. And Popo as well, if you want to go for Popo. But of course, it's a bit more situational to go to Popo because of the long game. You don't really care about Popo until later. And it's weird because you might even get into a situation where you're just prematurely calling it, but you want to call something else into your front row, like Poo-Poo and Yo-Yo. So then what ends up happening is that you're just sitting there with Popo in your back row, but then if your opponent plays a control deck, then they can just get rid of Popo. So it can be a bit awkward for Forbidor. It's not really that good in the deck in general. Like, it might be worth cutting, to be fair. And it does also help with decking out for Popo. It can do that because it's taking 2 cards out. Then lastly, Sanctitude. So Sanctitude is a 1-card drop PG, which is the reason for playing it, because it's just so good when you join to it in this deck. And then to go over the G zone, which I don't think there's much to talk about. I mean, maybe I should consider putting in Floral Witch Master Mimi, but otherwise Harmonix Messiah is there as a one-off, so you get your free 20k shield blitz order. You got the octagonal magus because especially when you're using 2 G guards, but if you're playing Adamant Angel as well to set up your damage checks, then you can also plan to use octagonal magus based on the future. So any sort of revealing you've done via Administrate Angel or any of the other G guards, you can then use Octagon Magus to then guarantee 40k shield and +1. So handy for that, but deck is very CB heavy, so 1 copy does make sense. 1 Dragon King because you're just not using a second copy of that. I don't think it's hardly as likely to come up, but space issues is part of it. Normally I was playing 2 in a lot of my decks before History Collection. The card is good as a first stride when your opponent goes first, or rides up first even. Then 2 copies of Momo, which originally I wasn't really keen on Momo, but because of Link Joker, I think Momo's needed for that matchup. But it is very difficult. Like, you are kind of throwing the game in the air, but it does at least make it a lot more playable than if you didn't play it. So it's still going to be an uphill struggle, but it's not as bad knowing you've got Momo in your G zone. And then 2 copies of Bavrois, just another G guard that can draw and stack triggers. 4 Ichikishima because that's the main finish of the deck. You're doing all those aggressive attacks. It's a turn-wide guard restrict, so even when you ride over, you still have the turn-wide guard restricts in effect. 2 Amaterasus for stacking, and there's no CB cost tied to that, which is really good. And it also soul charges as well. The thing is, this deck doesn't play Ichikishima or Amaterasu, so revealing doesn't matter in this deck. So if you just look at the top card of your deck, then it helps. 1 copy of Dismal because Dismal protects Yo-Yo, and then 2 copies of Kirin because of your History Collection plays. So that's more or less it with the History Collection deck profile mixed with Witches that I want to go through for many months now. And yeah, I mean, things could change. I have been thinking that I might play Razazel maybe in this deck, possibly. I mean, it'll be good with something like maybe Poo Poo, but sorry, I keep saying Razael. So Razael, that card can prevent deck out if you do get deck out, but this deck, it can last longer than other T decks. But of course, if the game drags on so much, it gets really bad. So once you get to like turn 6, you're not safe. You're probably decking out. So that's something to think about. Or maybe even turn 5, there could be a risk by that point. Depends how the game goes, to be fair. But yeah, that is an option, but it's usually a dead card in your hand for like most of the game. So that's something to think about with ODT, is maybe whether you play 1 or 2 copies. But Persona Riding, I've not really been as sure about, because Persona Riding, I've tried testing some hands in even just normal Susanoo, and the thing is that you're missing out on the stride break, and you're also negging 1 from your hand, which means, and you're not plussing back from it. So when you ride into Razael, you're actually making it harder to achieve the Oracle keyword. So then what that means is that Ichikishima is actually harder to activate. So you actually have to wait. You have to do it when you have to make sure you actually have enough hand size before you ride it. But if you don't end up doing that ride in the end, then what's the point of your other spare copies in your deck? Then they become dead cards. So I'm not convinced on Persona Ride engine at all in OTT. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's better to just stay away from the Persona Ride play. Just play 1 or 2 copies. Don't play any more than 2 Razaels in OTT when that card comes out. So yeah, that's more or less it. Hope you enjoyed the deck profile, and I will see you guys later. Bye.